It was the kind of place you see in those fancy postcards they sell back home. A chateau, they called it. Fancy word for a mansion. It had towering walls of pale stone, big windows that stared out like blank eyes, and ivy creeping up its sides like it was trying to strangle the life out of the place. If you squinted, you could see the grandeur it once had, before the war, before the shelling, before it became just another casualty in a world gone mad. But to me, it wasn't a postcard. It was just another stop on a journey I didn't want to be on. My name's Private James Connors, but everyone calls me Jimmy. I'm just a farm kid from Kansas who got yanked from the fields and thrown into this nightmare. When we rolled up to the chateau, I had mud on my boots, a rifle in my hands, and a growing knot in my stomach. The truck jerked to a stop, and the men around me groaned as they grabbed their gear. I glanced out at the chateau, its silhouette looming against the gray French sky. "Hell of a place to set up shop," I muttered. Corporal Matthews, sitting beside me, let out a low whistle. "Looks like it's seen better days," he said, shifting his helmet. "But it's haunted." "Oh, shut it," someone grumbled from the back. "You said the same thing about that farmhouse last week." Matthews grinned, but there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't entirely joking. As we filed out of the truck, the air hit me, cold and damp, with a strange stillness that made the hair on my neck stand up. The countryside had been noisy on the ride in, with the chatter of birds and the rustle of trees, but here, nothing. Just the wind whistling through the broken windows of the chateau. Captain Hughes was already barking orders, his voice cutting through the silence. "Connors, Matthews, get those supplies unloaded. Thompson, see about setting up the comms in that main hall. We're not here for a vacation, boys." "Yes, sir," I said, snapping a salute. Matthews shot me a look that said, "Easy there, soldier." As we moved toward the entrance, I got my first good look at the place. The double doors were splintered, one hanging slightly off its hinges. The windows were either boarded up or shattered, and the walls bore the scars of gunfire. But it was the inside that really got to me. The foyer was massive, with a high ceiling and a grand staircase that split into two directions. Dust coated everything, from the faded red carpet to the massive chandelier that hung precariously overhead. A few stray leaves and scraps of paper littered the floor, carried in by the wind. The whole place smelled like mildew and something else, something faint, metallic, and sour. "Damn," Matthews said, stepping inside beside me. "This place gives me the creeps." "It's just an old house," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to me. The first day was busy enough to keep my mind off things. We hauled crates of supplies, set up our sleeping quarters in what used to be a ballroom, and rigged up some lights with the portable generator we'd brought along. The hum of the generator was a welcome sound, breaking up the silence that seemed to cling to the walls. By evening, we were mostly settled. The officers had claimed the upper floors, while we grunt got to the ground level. Dinner was the usual, cold rations eaten in a circle, with the guys swapping stories to pass the time. Matthews, as usual, couldn't resist stirring the pot. "So, anyone else notice how the locals gave this place a wide berth?" he asked, leaning back against his pack. "That old man in the village practically spat on the ground when we mentioned the chateau." "Maybe he just doesn't like Americans," someone said, drawing a few laughs. "Nah, it's more than that," Matthews insisted. "Place like this? It's gotta have some history. I'm telling you, it's haunted." "Haunted my ass," Thompson said, lighting a cigarette. "If you're that scared, you can sleep outside." The laughter that followed felt forced, like we were all trying a little too hard to ignore the strange atmosphere. Me? I stayed quiet. Something about the place was gnawing at me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I didn't sleep much that night. The cot was lumpy, and the wind outside kept making the boards creak. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. A whisper. At first, I thought it was one of the guys talking in their sleep. But as I lay there, Staring up at the shadowy ceiling, I realized it wasn't coming from the dormitory. It was faint, like someone speaking just out of earshot, but it was enough to make me sit up and strain to listen. "Matthews?" I whispered, glancing over at his cot. He was snoring softly, dead to the world. The whisper came again. A word or two, maybe in French, though I couldn't be sure. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the door, my heart pounding. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb down the corridor. I stepped out, the floorboards creaking under my boots. "Hello?" My voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the vastness of the chateau. The whisper stopped. For a moment I stood there, gripping my rifle and feeling like a fool. Then I heard something else. The faint sound of footsteps, quick and light, like someone running barefoot. They came from the direction of the main hall. I followed, my pulse racing. The footsteps led me to the grand staircase, but when I reached the bottom, there was no one there. Just the empty hall, the chandelier swaying slightly as if moved by a breeze. "Get a grip, Jimmy," I muttered, turning back toward the dormitory. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I mentioned the noises to Matthews as we geared up for the day. He smirked. "Told you it was haunted," he said, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Later that day, a villager came by to deliver some supplies. He was an older man, wiry and weathered, with a face that looked like it had seen too much. As he unloaded his cart, he glanced up at the chateau and muttered something in French. "What's he saying?" I asked Thompson, who spoke a bit of the language. Thompson frowned. "Something about a curse. He says we shouldn't be here." I laughed nervously. "Great. That's comforting." The old man turned to me, his expression grave. He pointed at the chateau and said something else, his voice low and urgent. "What now?" I asked. Thompson hesitated. "He says the walls remember." "What's that supposed to mean?" The old man just shook his head and climbed back onto his cart. As he rode off, I couldn't help but feel like he'd left something behind, something heavy, invisible, and impossible to ignore. And so it began. The whispers, the footsteps, the sense that the chateau wasn't just a building. It was something alive, something watching, something waiting. I didn't know it then, but that first night was just the beginning. The chateau had secrets, and it wasn't done with us yet. The whispers didn't stop after that first night. If anything, they grew louder. And it wasn't just me hearing them anymore. 2 nights after my first encounter, I woke to find Matthews sitting upright on his cot, staring at the doorway. His face was pale and sweat gleamed on his forehead despite the cold. "Matthews? You good?" I whispered, careful not to wake the others. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkened hall beyond the dormitory. "Did you see her?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "See who?" I asked, sitting up. "The woman," he said, his hands trembling as they gripped his blanket. She was standing in the doorway, just staring at me. I thought it was a dream, but a chill ran down my spine. "You're imagining things," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Get some sleep." He nodded, but didn't lie back down. I watched him sit there for what felt like hours before exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next day, Matthews and I were assigned to sweep the upper floors. Captain Hughes wanted to make sure there weren't any structural issues that could cause problems. It sounded simple enough, but the thought of exploring the shadowy halls and forgotten rooms of the chateau filled me with dread. The second floor was worse than the first. The air was colder, the walls damp with streaks of water damage. Most of the rooms were empty, save for the occasional broken chair or overturned table. But one door, near the end of the west wing, was locked tight. "That's odd," Matthews said, jiggling the handle. "Why's this one locked?" Maybe it's jammed, I said, though I didn't believe it. The other doors had all been hanging off their hinges or swinging open freely. You got a crowbar? Matthews grinned, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Always come prepared. He pulled a crowbar from his pack and wedged it into the gap between the door and the frame. With a grunt, he forced the door open. The smell hit us first, a sharp, sour stench that made my stomach churn. Matthews gagged, pulling his shirt up over his nose. Jesus, he muttered. Inside, the room was small and dimly lit by a single, grimy window. The floor was covered in debris, broken glass, scraps of paper, and bloodstains, faded but unmistakable. Against one wall, a small pile of belongings sat untouched, a child's wooden toy, a pair of shoes, and a journal with a cracked leather cover. Matthews bent down and picked up the journal. Think this belongs to someone local? He asked, flipping it open. The writing was in French. Neither of us could make sense of it, but the drawings inside were enough to send a shiver down my spine. Sketches of soldiers in old uniforms, a family huddled together in fear. One image that made my blood run cold was a figure standing in a dark hallway, its face obscured but its eyes glowing faintly. Let's take this to Thompson, I said, my voice tight. He's the closest thing we've got to a translator. Thompson took one look at the journal and groaned. You find the creepiest shit, Connors. Just tell us what it says, Matthews snapped, pacing nervously. Thompson flipped through the pages, muttering to himself as he tried to translate. After a few minutes, he looked up, his expression grim. It's a diary, he said. Belonged to a girl. She lived here during the occupation. And? I prompted. She talks about hiding in the cellar with her family, Thompson continued. About soldiers coming to the house, people screaming. There's a lot I can't make out, but it's not good. Matthews stopped pacing. What happened to them? Thompson shook his head. Doesn't say. The entries just stop. But there's a line at the end. Something about the walls remembering. Sound familiar? My stomach twisted. The villager's words echoed in my mind. The walls remember. That night, the chateau felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on us. More of the guys started reporting strange occurrences. Thompson swore he saw someone standing at the end of a hall, only for them to vanish when he called out. Another soldier claimed his equipment had been moved during the night. Even Captain Hughes seemed on edge. He spent most of the evening in the command room, poring over maps with a cigarette dangling from his lips. When I asked if he'd noticed anything strange, he gave me a sharp look. Focus on your duties, Connors, he said curtly, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear he couldn't quite hide. The whispers came again that night, louder this time, and with them came something worse. Laughter, soft, mocking, and echoing through the halls like it was bouncing off the walls themselves. I lay on my cot staring at the ceiling, clutching my rifle like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Somewhere, deep in the chateau, a door slammed shut. The sound sent a jolt through me, but I didn't move. I couldn't. It was as if the darkness itself was holding me down. The next morning, Matthews was gone. His cot was empty, his gear untouched. At first, we thought he might have gone to the latrine or stepped outside for air. But as the hours passed, worry turned to panic. A search party was organized, and we combed every inch of the chateau, calling his name. It was Thompson who found him, curled up in the corner of the locked room we'd broken into the day before. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't respond when we spoke to him, didn't even flinch when Captain Hughes shook him by the shoulders. "Get the medic," Hughes barked, his voice strained. But I knew it wouldn't help. Whatever Matthews had seen, it had broken something inside him. As they carried him out, I noticed something on the wall above him. At first I thought it was just another stain, but as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't random. It was a handprint, small, delicate, and smeared with something dark. Blood, and beneath it, scratched into the plaster, were 2 words: "Leave now." The warnings on the wall didn't stop us. Maybe they should have. Captain Hughes ordered the team to double down on patrols and keep an eye out for unwelcome visitors. He didn't outright say what we all knew he was thinking. Whatever had gotten to Matthews wasn't human. It was easier for everyone to act like it was just a bad case of nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the Chateau wanted us to stay, like it was playing a game with us, pulling us deeper into its web. The whispers grew worse over the next few nights. They seemed to seep from the very walls, creeping into our heads even when we were wide awake. The laughter, mocking, cold, followed us everywhere. One night, as I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, a new sound joined the chorus: knocking. Faint at first, just a light tap, tap, tap that could have been the wind rattling an old shutter. But then it grew louder, more deliberate, until it echoed through the halls. I sat up, heart hammering. "You hear that?" I asked Thompson, who was on watch near the doorway. He nodded, his hand already on his rifle. "It's coming from below." "The cellar? Where else?" I didn't want to go down there, but something about the sound drew me in. It wasn't just noise, it was a beckoning, an invitation. Thompson and I grabbed flashlights and made our way down the winding staircase to the cellar. The air grew colder with every step, thick with dampness and decay. The beams of our flashlights wavered across stone walls and piles of forgotten crates. At the far end of the cellar stood an old wooden door, partially ajar. The knocking had stopped, but a faint rustling sound came from the other side. Thompson hesitated. You think we should call Hughes?" "No," I said, though I wasn't sure why. "Let's just check it out." We pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was small, with walls lined by shelves holding dusty jars and bottles. But the center of the room was bare except for a single object: a mirror. It was old, its surface cloudy with age, but the frame was ornate, carved with strange symbols that made my skin crawl. The rustling stopped as we stepped closer. "Why is there a mirror down here?" Thompson muttered. I shook my head. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. As I approached, my flashlight flickered. A shadow moved across the surface of the glass, but it wasn't mine. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Thompson didn't answer. When I turned, he was staring into the mirror, his face pale and blank. "Thompson." I reached for him, but before I could touch his shoulder, he let out a choked scream and stumbled backward. The mirror cracked. After that night, Thompson wasn't the same. He spoke less and flinched at shadows that weren't there. The others noticed too, but no one said anything. Not directly. Everyone was too busy battling their own demons. The cracks in the mirror seemed to spread into the fabric of our lives. The equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Rations spoiled overnight. And the laughter. It followed us everywhere, growing bolder, more malicious. I tried to talk to Captain Hughes about it, but he brushed me off. "We're under a lot of stress," he said. "War does things to a man's mind." But it wasn't just the men. The chateau itself seemed to be alive, its walls pulsing with an unseen energy. Doors that we'd locked the night before would be wide open, come morning. Shadows moved in places no light could reach, and always, at the edge of my vision, I saw her. The woman Matthews had mentioned. She never came close, but she was always there, watching. 3 nights after the cellar incident, Private O'Malley disappeared. One minute he was on watch. The next, he was gone. We found his rifle near the east wing, its barrel bent as though it had been gripped by something far stronger than any human. Captain Hughes organized another search, but it was half-hearted. We all knew we wouldn't find him. Not alive, anyway. That night, I dreamed of the cellar, of the mirror. I saw myself standing before it, my reflection staring back at me with empty eyes. And then the reflection smiled. I woke in a cold sweat, gasping for air. The whispers were louder now, forming words I couldn't quite understand. But one word came through clear as day. Stay. It was Thompson who broke first. He stormed into the command room during dinner, wild-eyed and trembling. "We're not alone here," he said, slamming the journal down on the table. "We know that already," Hughes snapped. "Sit down before you hurt yourself." "No, you don't understand." Thompson's voice cracked. "The girl in the journal, she saw them too. The ones in the shadows. They're not ghosts, they're something else. They're old, and they're hungry." His words sent a ripple of unease through the room. Even Hughes couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. "What do they want?" someone asked. Thompson's gaze shifted to the floor. "Us." Thompson's words left a heavy silence in the room. Nobody wanted to believe him, but deep down, we all knew he wasn't lying. The chateau had been playing tricks on us from the moment we arrived, and now it felt like whatever was inside had stopped pretending. It wanted us to know it was there. Captain Hughes cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly. "We're soldiers," he said, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "We've faced worse than shadows. We'll get through this." But his words rang hollow. None of us believed it. That night, Hughes called for a meeting in the command room. The air was tense, and every creak of the old chateau made us jump. Hughes laid out a map of the estate, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. "Whatever's happening here," he began, "it's coming from below. The cellar." Thompson nodded, though he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "The journal mentioned the cellar," he said. "The girl's family hid down there when it happened, whatever it is." "And the mirror?" I asked. "A warning," Thompson said grimly. "Or a trap." Hughes exhaled slowly, the smoke curling upward like a ghostly hand. "We're going down there," he said. "All of us. We're going to find out what's really happening in this godforsaken place, and we're going to end it." We armed ourselves to the teeth. Rifles, grenades, flashlights, anything that might give us an edge against whatever was waiting below. The air grew colder as we descended into the cellar, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The door to the mirror room was still ajar, the crack in the glass spreading like a spider web. Hughes led the way, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. I stayed close behind, my heart pounding with every step. The room was just as we'd left it, but now the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. The symbols on the mirror's frame seemed to glow faintly, as though responding to our presence. "There's something behind it," Hughes said, his voice low. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the edge of the mirror. A low, guttural sound filled the room. Not quite a growl, not quite a whisper. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Step back," I said, my voice shaking. But Hughes didn't listen. With a sharp tug, he pulled the mirror away from the wall. Behind it was a narrow passage, the stone walls slick with moisture. A faint light pulsed at the far end like the beating of a heart. "We move together," Hughes said, his voice steadier than I expected. "Stay close." The passage led us to a cavernous chamber, the walls etched with the same strange symbols from the mirror. At the center of the room stood an altar, and on it lay a figure wrapped in tattered cloth. It was hard to tell if it was human or something else entirely. The light we'd seen came from above, where a crack in the stone ceiling revealed the night sky. But the light didn't feel like moonlight. It was colder and harsher, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. "What the hell is this?" Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the whispers returned. Louder now, almost deafening. They seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very air around us. Hughes stepped toward the altar, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure on the altar stirred, its head turning slowly toward us. Empty eye sockets stared back, and a mouth twisted into a grin that was too wide, too wrong. "You should have left," it said, its voice layered with 1,000 others. Hughes raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the room erupted into chaos. Shadows peeled away from the walls, taking shape and lunging toward us. They moved too fast, too fluidly to be real, their forms shifting and twisting like smoke. "Fire!" Hughes shouted, his voice breaking. We opened fire, the chamber filling with the deafening roar of gunshots. But the bullets passed through the shadows as if they weren't there. One by one the men fell, dragged into the darkness by unseen hands. Their screams echoed long after they were gone. I don't remember how I escaped. One moment I was firing blindly into the dark. The next I was back in the cellar, gasping for air. Thompson was beside me, his face pale and streaked with blood. "Where's Hughes?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Thompson shook his head. "Gone. They took him." The whispers were quieter now, almost satisfied. The chateau seemed to settle around us, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. But I knew it wasn't over. Not really. As we stumbled back up to the surface, I glanced back at the mirror. The cracks had spread completely, the glass now a jagged mosaic, and in its fractured surface I saw her again, the woman. She smiled at me, her eyes glowing faintly. "You stayed," she said, though her lips didn't move. We left the chateau at first light, leaving behind our gear and what little sanity we had left. The villagers watched us from a distance, their expressions grim. They didn't ask what had happened. They already knew. Back at headquarters, our story was met with disbelief. Hughes and the others were listed as MIA, and we were sent for psychiatric evaluations. But nothing they said could erase what we'd seen. Thompson and I never spoke of it again. He was transferred to another unit, and I heard he didn't make it through the war. As for me, I've tried to move on, but the whispers follow me wherever I go. The chateau is still out there, waiting, and the walls remember. Thanks for watching. What did you think of the story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like this.